Good morning. I was not prepared for how that song would affect me. I don't know about you, but I didn't grow up in the 90s. I was all grown up already in the 90s. But as I looked at our team up here, I thought, wow, half of them weren't born yet. I know Evan wasn't born yet back here. And just the power of Juliana starting that song. Golly days. I, hey, if you're here for the first time, I don't usually cry at the beginning of the message, so I kind of apologize for that. But it was really meaningful to just think of how God is faithful. Some of you are lucky to make it through the 90s to get to this point, and that God was at work at that point and pulling this string that puts our lives together and in this place right now is an amazing thing. And the premise of this whole series that we're in, All Jesus All Summer, is everything changes. It's different than the 90s now. But our God is the same. That Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so that's what we're talking about here this summer together. So I'm glad you're with us. We're in the middle. This is part 5 of this series. So if you're just jumping on board, that's our premise. Is that with everything changing around us, there's got to be something that we anchor to that doesn't change, and that happens to be a person, Jesus Christ. It says, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the question that we keep asking ourselves is, well, will you let Jesus be Jesus? And you might think, well, what's the other option? And the other option that we've discussed is, well, we tend to, instead of that, there's a temptation that we all have, every one of us, me included, to make Jesus the way we'd like him to be. And so he looks more like the plastic Jesus on the dashboard of our car. And the problem with that, and there is a problem, the problem is if it's not the real Jesus, there's no real power. And so you can turn to the Jesus of your own creation and ask for as much as you want, and there's probably not going to be any reception. Why? Because if it's not the real Jesus, there's no real power. Now, we said that if the Jesus that you follow never confronts you, it might be a tip-off that it's not the real one. And if you were with us last week, we read about a miracle where Jesus healed a man who had a withered hand, but the passage was much more about a confrontation than it was about the healing. It was about a confrontation of stubborn hearts and a dysfunctional religious system. So the truth that you can take away from that is the ministry of Jesus is not only one of comfort, it is also one of confrontation. And some of you emailed me last week and said, enough of the confrontation already. I feel convicted enough. Stop. And so I think that's a good sign, because that's the real Jesus. If yours doesn't ever confront you or disagree with you, you've got the plastic one, and it's not going to work very well. Well, this morning we're going to look at another healing, and it's a healing that has everything to teach us about what faith is. Faith is a word that is used and abused all over the place in our day. Think about the ways that you've heard the word faith used in the last several months. My guess is you've heard somebody talk about a faith-based organization. I'm not sure what that actually means, but the government has attached, a moniker to things like churches and other things, and they're called faith-based organizations. You might heard somebody called a person of faith. Somebody might ask you if you've come to faith. You might hear it. Somebody say, "Have some faith," or "Keep the faith." Even my favorite artist of all time, Bruce Springsteen, sings about, "Show a little faith. There's magic in the night. You ain't a beauty, but you're all right." And so faith is just thrown around all over the place, this word. Blind faith. If somebody says, you just have blind faith, they basically are calling you an idiot. They're thinking, that doesn't make any sense to me. So with all of that backdrop, listen to this verse from Hebrews chapter 11. It says this. I'm not going to put it up on the screen. I want you zoned in right now. Ready? It says this. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. impossible to please God. How important is faith? Well, it's critically important, and yet we're all over the map in terms of what we think it means, display that we believe about how we use this word. So, with that critical importance, Jesus has something to teach you and me about faith. Are you ready to learn? It's all right, we're going to do it anyway, even if you're not ready to learn. So, Mark chapter 9 is where we're going to have our lesson. And there's, in fact, more than one lesson in here. And I don't know what your capacity is this morning. Some of you need to learn 4 lessons. Some of you just need to take away 1 lesson. But you're not going to know till the end how many God wants you to learn, so you might as well pay attention for the whole thing. So we're going to do Mark chapter 9, and we're going to read this incredible encounter that Jesus has with a boy and his father. So Mark chapter 9, I'm going to read verses 14 through 29. A little bit longer passage than last week. So follow along if you have a Bible, or it'll be up on the screens here. Listen. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him onto the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us. Help us." "If you can," Jesus said, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." This is God's word. And there are some lessons in there. And some lessons about faith. And you might say, read the word faith is not in that story, not even once. And you're technically right in the version that I read you, but what I want you to know is that in the Bible, the word for faith and the word for belief are the same word. The word pistis in Greek is translated sometimes faith, faithful, and oftentimes believe, and what you believe. And those two words are synonymous in the original language. And so the word that faith and belief is repeated 4 times here. Did you see it? 4 times. 2 positive and 2 negative. And the whole story revolves around us learning about faith, about belief. And so I think there are at least 4 lessons to learn. I don't know how many you're supposed to learn this morning, but we're going to learn about the unexpected occasion for faith. We're going to learn about the certain enemy of faith. We're going to learn about the authentic display of faith. And then finally, we're going to look at the unsettling result of faith. We're going to look at the occasion, the enemy, the display, and the results of faith. Are you ready? We're going to do it anyway. Here we go. Verse 14. It starts by saying, they. And you have to understand who the they is. They is Jesus and Peter, James, and John. And where were they? They were coming down from a mountain. The the mountain that they had been on with Jesus, where they watched Jesus be transformed before their very eyes. He became white, it said, gleaming like lightning. And there were some old dead guys who showed up and spoke with him, Moses and Elijah. And Peter, James, and John were there witnessing all of this. How would you respond if that happened to you tomorrow? You walk out to get the paper, and there's some really old, dead guys there talking with Jesus, and you're in their midst. I don't know how I would respond. But here's how Peter responds. He says, this is a good place. We should stay right here. I'll get to work building some tents for everyone. And I think, have you ever had a mountaintop experience like that? Where God is more real to you than maybe He's been in the past or been in a long, long while? Have you had those experiences? Maybe it's on a Sunday morning. Maybe it's on a retreat somewhere. Maybe it's with a group of friends from your past, your faith journey that they get together. But from time to time, many of us have what we would call a mountaintop type of experience, where God feels closer to us, God feels more real, God feels more tangible maybe. Maybe it's when you're serving. That's what they're having here. And so they have this mountaintop experience, and Peter has a very common reaction. Most of us have the same reaction. This is a good place. Let's stay here. And here's what you are going to see in this passage. That never happens. You never get to stay there for very long. And that's actually a good thing. And here's why. Because mountaintops are not where faith grows. It's a great thing. It's a good feeling. It's a good experience when you have this mountaintop experience. But faith doesn't grow there. Faith grows down at the bottom of the mountain. See, down at the bottom of the mountain is where there's a dad, and he's at the end of his rope, and he doesn't know what to do. And down at the bottom of the mountain is where faith blooms. It's the unexpected occasion for faith, is when you're at the bottom of the mountain. See, the bottom of the hill is where the Father's at the end of his ropes, where ministry makes a difference and faith gets put to use. And listen, this is the only reason for faith, is to put it to use. See, faith is not something that you bank. Faith is not something that you accumulate. Faith is something that you use. And if it's not functional, it's not faith. And so the unexpected occasion for faith is not at the top of the mountain, it's actually at the bottom of the mountain. And we're going to watch that unfold. See, so that's who the they is. Peter, James, and John had this experience. They didn't stay there. They get to the bottom of the mountain, and what do they find? Well, they find a desperate dad and a sick son. But that's not all who are there. Who else are there? All the rest of the disciples, the 9 other disciples. And then it says there's teachers of the law. So we got the desperate dad, the sick son, the disciples, and the teachers of the law. And what are they doing? Well, it says in verse 14, they were arguing. So this is the picture that Jesus walks in on. Desperate dad, sick son, lots of religious people. And instead of focusing on the people in need, the religious folk are all arguing amongst themselves. Does that sound familiar to anyone in the room? Yeah. That's been going on for a long time. We're not the first ones. It wasn't right then. It's not right now. And I don't get it. Why, when there are people in need right there, the religious folk just get together and argue about stuff? That's not faith. It's an opportunity for faith that they're in fact missing. So I'm just trying to picture this. Can you picture the scenario? That the dad is desperate, the son is sick, the religious people are all around, and they're sort of waiting. And there's this argument going on that apparently they're probably left out of, the dad and the son. And the teachers of the law are like, well, I told you you guys weren't following the right person. That's why you can't heal this guy. And they said, we are too following the right person. You guys are all caught up in your dysfunctional system. Remember the guy with the hand? Didn't you learn anything from that lesson? Don't you tell me what we're supposed to learn from that lesson, because don't you know who I am? We're the authority. And all of this happening. And in walks Jesus. I don't know how they would have responded, but I know how I would have responded. I go, hey, Jesus, we were just talking about you. Come on over. And just the conviction in their lives probably was palpable. You could probably feel it no matter who you were. And so notice that everyone, it says in verse 15, was pro-Jesus. So it says when they saw Jesus, everyone got excited and ran to go see him. All of the pro-Jesus people were missing it before he showed up. And that's challenging to me, because it's not enough, apparently, to just wave the Jesus flag and say, yay, Jesus, yay, I'm all for him. If we miss the opportunity to display faith with people who are in need right around us, that apparently is missing the boat. And so this is the unexpected occasion of faith. What do you learn? Well, you learn this. Anyone here have unmet needs in your life? Anyone know anyone with unmet needs in your life? Anyone here have a conflict going on at some area of your life? Anyone here facing a situation that is slightly out of your control? Have I covered everybody yet? Here's what that means. You are in a perfect place to grow your faith. That is the occasion where faith grows. That's what we see here. Right into this situation where there's conflict, there's unmet needs, there's out of control situations, walks Jesus, and he's going to teach them about faith. And so if any of that applies to you this morning, you're in the right place. Jesus, this is an occasion for you and me to grow our faith. That's the first lesson. There's an unexpected occasion for faith. It's not the top of the mountain. It's the bottom of the mountain. And so we can all learn. Second lesson. There's the certain enemy of faith. Did you see what happens then in verse 16? Jesus asks this question. Now, remember what we always say when Jesus asks a question? It's not for his information, right? Because he's Jesus. He already knows the answer, presumably, to the question. So he's asking for their benefit. And what's his question? In verse 15, he says, what are you arguing about? And I just see, I love Jesus. He's like, did anybody notice the people? And just asking this question, he brings up, the point is always the people, fellas. You can argue about it later. Do you notice the people that are right around you in need? So he asks him this question, what are you arguing about? And the dad answers. And the dad answers in verses 17 and 18. He tells this story about how his kid is hurting and has had this condition, and the dad is desperate at this point for some healing. And he uses these words to describe what's wrong. He says, there is an impure or unclean spirit that causes him this physical condition. So we have to stop and say, what's that about? What's this evil spirit or unclean spirit about here? Sometimes when that stuff comes up in the Bible, we tend to just gloss over it and say, well, that's old-time stuff. They would have called him like an epileptic today or something like that. And that might have some moniker of truth, but it's deeper than that, and we need to address it a little bit this morning. What does it mean when it says there's an unclean spirit here? Well, here's the truth. The Bible teaches that there is a spiritual, supernatural evil in the world. There's no way around it. That's what the Bible teaches. And there's two ways for us to discuss that topic. One is theologically, and that's fascinating to me. I could talk all day about the theological implications of a supernatural evil in the world. Did God create it? Did God allow it? Did God, because he wanted to have free loving beings, necessitate free will, and free will necessitates the choice for not good and not good? I could go on and on and on. That's interesting. It's not so helpful for most of us, though. But if you want to have that discussion, I'd love to do it. We'll do it at a different time. Probably the second way to talk about the way that the Bible deals with evil and supernatural evil is on a practical level. Because on a practical level, most people that I've met realize that there's something going on in their lives, in the struggle of their lives, that's beyond the physical or psychological. That there is a spiritual component to it. I'll tell you, especially our friends who are in the recovery movement, understand that it's not simply a physical deal. It's not simply giving myself a pep talk or putting up barriers so I can't do the thing. Especially people who are dealing with habitual struggle. Like, I thought I was finished with this, but it keeps coming up. I hear over and over again, and I experience in my own life, that there is something else going on here where I would love to be finished with this, but it hangs on, and it's like there's something or someone who doesn't want me to grow out of this. Do you know what I'm talking about? Whatever you call it, most people that I meet go, yeah, I know what that is. I've sensed that, I've seen that in my spouse. I've seen that in my dad. I see that there's something else going on besides just the physical, just the psychological. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. There's two equally dangerous errors in responding to the Bible teaching that there is a personal supernatural evil. One is to give it too much attention. Mm-hmm. In other words, I've met people who there's a demon around every corner. You know, there's a demon in my hairdo because I woke up and it was like way out like this. And so I had to, pray against the demon of the frizzy hair. I'd be like, no, that's humidity. That's actually not a demon. One error, dangerous error, is to see demons around every corner, to give too much response to the teaching that this supernatural evil, in fact, exists. The second error is to give it no response, to ignore the clear teaching of the Scripture that this is a reality, that there is an enemy that does not want any of us to experience the life that God has designed for us. And so I would challenge you, either side of this equation, to fall on one side or the other is dangerous. It's dangerous to keep looking for another demon around every corner, or to be afraid of them, of it, of that force. It's not something to be given too much response to, but it's also not something to be ignored. And if you do, you will find yourself coming up against a dead end often in the changes that even, not that someone else says you need to make, but that you'd like to make in your life. You need help to do the things that you want to do. Have you noticed that? Yeah. That's because of the spiritual component. So maybe the last thing I'll say about this is, when there's a question like this and something that I can't explain to you all about, I go with Jesus' interpretation. I go with the guy who predicted that he would die and rise again and then did it. And notice that Jesus doesn't correct the dad. When the dad says, there's a spirit that makes my son do this, Jesus doesn't go, oh, silly dad. There's no spirit. He doesn't correct him. And often, Jesus talks about the reality of supernatural evil. And so when in doubt, I just go with his interpretation. And at the very least, we can say this, that every aspect of our lives that is not what we'd hoped it would be, every struggle and pain is at least a result of sin. And sin enters the world, evil enters the world, not haphazardly, but on purpose. And so you want to look at, we did a whole series on that. Go get the What's Really Wrong with the World talk. But at least we learned there that every broken cell and every broken system in our world really goes back to there is an enemy. And the enemy does not want us to embrace the life that Jesus has for us. Now, if that weirds you out, good. That probably means it's the real thing. Probably means it's the real Jesus who's given you some information that makes you feel uncomfortable. Here's what we do with that, is we say, okay, well, what do we learn then? We learn that there is a certain enemy of faith. In other words, if it is impossible to please God without faith, you can be certain that one of the bullseyes that the enemy has is your faith and mine. It just makes sense, does it not? So there is a certain enemy of faith. So while it is true that struggles and conflict can be an occasion for faith, it's just as true that in the hands of the enemy, that same occasion can be a barrier to faith. And that's certainly the case here, right? Before Jesus shows up, no one's growing in their faith in this scenario. You know, I think about that in my own life, and I think about how when I was fired from a job before this one, I shared that news with one of my best friends who was in the part of launching this church. And I said to Joe, I'm the rug just got pulled out from under me. I don't know what to do. And Joe responded in a really peculiar way. He sort of was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I feel really bad for you. And it's just the oddest thing. I was thinking, I mean, he's saying the right things, but he does not look like he's very troubled about this news that I have given him. And it didn't take him long before he said, well, you know, Reed, I think you're supposed to be the pastor of our church. And I said, you don't even have a church. It's just in a garage. That doesn't qualify like as a church, Joe. And he's like, I know. And so you see, the same occasion could have been, in the hands of the enemy, a real blow to my faith. Or, in the eyes of a trusted friend pointing me to Christ, it was an opportunity. It was an occasion for my faith to grow. Same thing. So this is what Jesus walks in on, right? There's this intersection. There's conflict. There's unmet need. There's arguing going on. It could be a perfect occasion for faith, or it could be, in the hands of the enemy, a barrier to faith. And in walks Jesus. Now, I want you to notice, before we go to number 3, that Jesus does not respond to the fellows who could not heal the man by saying, oh, I'm so sorry. Nice try, boys. Well, way to go. Get them next time. Does not give them a pep talk. Not at all. What does Jesus say? Verse 19. O unbelieving generation, how long will I put up with you? Does that sound harsh to you? Yeah, that's not the Clorox Jesus who pets the sheep all the time, right? It is an in-your-face Jesus who says, unbelieving generations. This is the first time that this word is used in this passage. It's used in the negative. You people without faith, you unbelieving people. And it ticks him off. And he says, bring him to me. Bring the boy here. And then we learn lesson number 3. Because the Father's authentic display of faith might not be what you think it would look like. So Jesus says, bring the boy here. And what's the first thing that happens? It gets worse. Right? The boy apparently is standing there, so the father has to tell the story about what's wrong with the kid. But as soon as he brings him to Jesus, it gets worse. He starts thrashing around. He has an episode. He has convulsions. And so it goes from bad to worse when you put Jesus into the equation. Anybody experience that in your life? Yeah. Sometimes it feels like it's getting worse. And then you hear the desperation in the Father's voice. If you can do anything to help, look at my boy. And then Jesus says this often was peculiar to me. How long has he been like this? Again, probably not for Jesus information. And I always wondered, what does that have to do with anything? Like if he said, oh, it just started last year, Jesus would be like, well, come back and see me when it's been 5. Or something like that. Well, it's like when you think that you have strep throat or something, and they're like, no, it hasn't been long enough that you've been in serious pain for us to give you the antibiotics. Come back next week if you feel really horrible. And then what was the point? I think it was this identifying with this dad who, as Jesus watches his son suffer, he says, how long have you had to deal with this? And the dad says, I have seen this many, many times. I've watched my boy. And every time it happens, I think this might be it. And I think Jesus is empathizing, wants to, in some ways, enter into this story. That's a hard, hard story. And wants to say, let's get it all out on the table. It's really bad, isn't it? Yes, it is. And you have no other hope, do you? I have no other hope. And if you can do anything, would you have pity on us? Help, help, help. I don't know, help. And then Jesus says, if you can, anything is possible to those who believe. Second use of the word in the positive. He rebukes one group of people for not having any faith. And then he says, everything is possible for those who have faith. And then the Father responds. What does he say? I believe. Can you help me with my unbelief? It says immediately, so right on the tip of his tongue is this response. I do believe. Help me though, because I don't believe too. Do you get that? I get that answer. He's saying, I do have faith. I've also got not faith. I can see that you really know me already, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Jesus. I do believe. I do trust, but I also don't trust. At the same time, does that sound okay? I do believe. I also don't believe. Can you help me, Jesus? I get that answer. I understand. How much faith does that answer include? I wouldn't say an enormous deal, but there's a little bit. Would you agree? There's a little bit. It's not 100%. It's like, I've got, I don't know, maybe it's 50-50, maybe it's 60-40, I don't know. But he's got a little bit of faith, but he's also got a little bit of not faith. And apparently, that's what the expression of faith looks like. It doesn't look like all faith and no not faith. It doesn't look like no doubts. For the one who believes, Jesus then heals the boy. That's all. That's enough. So apparently, that's what the expression of faith looks like. Here's what we learn. Lesson number 3. Faith and doubt coexist. Faith and doubt get held together, and it doesn't make the faith inoperable. In fact, doubt is not the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith, somebody said, is certainty. You have to have a little bit of uncertainty to have faith required. And he's got some. And it doesn't negate his faith. More importantly, The effectiveness of faith is not based on the absence of doubt, but the presence of God. Here, let me say it a different way. The object of your faith is the important thing. It's not the amount of your faith that determines the outcome of your situation. The object of your faith, not the amount of your faith, determines the outcome of your situation. That's why it's better to have 1% faith in God than 100% faith in you or in somebody else who's sitting around you. Better to have 1% in the object with the power than 100% in people who don't. And so this is the authentic display of faith. That means you all have enough faith right now to put it to use. You do. You don't need any more. Does that mean you have enough to answer every question? No. Does it mean you have enough to remove every doubt? No. But you have enough to use it. If you look at the authentic display of faith, I got to wrap up because we're going to do something cool here at the end. But last, we learn the unsettling result of faith. Because you thought it was bad before. Jesus heals the boy, and what does everybody looking at him assume? You read it. He's dead. You killed him, Jesus. Can you imagine this? I do believe, help my unbelief. Okay. And they're going, he's dead. You killed him. Some of you know what that feels like. Some of you have had a relationship and you've given it to God and then it was over. Some of you have had, right, like a dream, like an opportunity that you laid down before the Lord and then the opportunity was gone, dead. Some of you have had hopes and dreams and you surrendered them to God. I surrender my dream to you, God, and then the dream died. And you're thinking, wait, what's going on here? How many of you tell me, Reed, I started following Jesus and then life got harder? I go, yeah. You didn't tell me that on the front end. I know, it's our little secret. We want you to, Here's the end. Jesus is the only one who gets to decide what's dead and what's not. He reaches down. He says, I have not decided that he's dead. So he's not. And he lifts the boy up. Because he is the author of life and the one who surrenders his life for us, he gets to decide what dies and what lives. And so he decides, not yet. This is not dead. Not yet. That dream isn't dead. Not yet. That relationship, not over yet. That one is. And he has that power in him. That's the real Jesus. That's the real Jesus. All right, I want to leave time for this at the end because the last line here is probably one that you've heard before. If you've heard this story before. After it's all said and done, the disciples go back and they go, how'd you do that? How does this work? Because clearly we don't understand how this works. And Jesus says the most peculiar thing. Well, peculiar in context. Not peculiar if you take it out of context. Because he says, this one comes out only by what? Prayer. Which, if you take that out of context, makes all the sense in the world. It would be like Peter going, I should have thought of that. Prayer, of course. That makes sense. But then Jesus never prayed. Jesus gives him this explanation, and then he never actually prayed. Here's what I think is going on there. He's not giving them a formula. He's giving them a prescription. He's saying, you need to be in tune with the Father. You need to. It's not like, let me write that down. X plus Y squared equals, I missed the squaring of I'll get it right next time. No, God might do it a completely different way next time. God just wants you to bring to him yourself. And that's what we're going to do here at the end of the service. We're going to, it'd be silly to say that this kind only happens by prayer and then not allow you and someone to pray for you. So that's what we're going to do. And here's the way I want this to go. I'd love for the band to come on back up because they're going to play a song. And we're not going to wait till the end of the song to have folks come up to be prayed for. But during the song, as soon as we start, I would love for you to come up. And here's what I want. We're going to have a bunch of people all the way across here on both sides. And I would love for you to come up for a prayer that will just be a very brief invitation of God to enter right where you're living today. So when you come up, I don't want you to tell your life story to the people that are standing here. I want you just to give them a one sentence. That's God. See, God knows already, right? He doesn't ask questions for His information. So I want you, if you're struggling with an addiction right now, I just want you to come up and say, I'm struggling with an addiction. Can you pray for me? And we're going to pray. Boom. I want you, like this father, if there's someone in your life that's not here or that's on your heart, I just want you to come up and say, I need you to pray for my grandson. That's it. God knows, and we'll pray for your grandson. Tell us his name. We'll pray. I want you to come up. I just need you to pray for my marriage. Boom. We're going to pray. Not long prayers, 20, 30 seconds. There'll be multiple people. And you don't leave without an opportunity for someone to pray. If that would be the way that God has been prompting you through the end of this talk. Or, let me do one more. If you're in recovery, and let's say you've got 6 months sober, I would love for you to come up. It'll be so encouraging to people who love you and support you. And you just come up, and here's what you say. I'm 6 months clean. Bam. We'll just give thanks. Pray God tomorrow. You know it's only one day at a time. Tomorrow, we'll pray. Okay? So if you are part of the group of men and women who are going to be praying, would you guys come up now? And if you think you might be, you should come on up. Okay? Because we want to have a whole bunch of people on the front. That means you have to stand up right now. There you go. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks, you guys. Come on up. And just across on both sides. So let me pray. We're going to sing. And then as soon as we start singing, you guys just come on up. Let's go on both sides of the stage. Pray with me. God, thank you for this picture of faith and where faith grows and how it grows, and that we're all in a great spot this morning to see faith in action in our own lives. So we want you to lead us, guide us, grow our faith here this morning, Jesus. We pray it in your name. Amen.